The night the billionaire's stepdaughter vanished, the house didn't panic. It locked down. That's an important difference. Panic is loud, messy, emotional. Lockdown is controlled, calculated, every door sealed, every phone checked, every version of the story aligned before anyone outside could ask a question. By the time the staff realized she was gone, the narrative was already forming. She needed space. She was overwhelmed. She wandered off. None of it was true. And I knew that before anyone finished the sentence. Because when you spend enough time watching how power operates, you learn one thing very clearly. People don't disappear by accident inside houses like this. They are removed. Or they leave because staying is no longer safe. The alarms hadn't been triggered. The gates were closed. Security was tight. Cameras were supposedly active. And yet, she was nowhere to be found. That alone told me everything. If she had been taken, they would have called the police immediately. Public urgency creates sympathy. It establishes innocence. But this wasn't urgency. This was containment. The billionaire stood in the center of the main hall, calm in a way that felt rehearsed. Phones pressed to ears, orders given quietly, the kind of calm that only exists when someone believes they still control the outcome. The stepmother cried on cue, perfect timing, perfect volume, just enough for witnesses. No one looked at me. That's how I knew I still mattered. Because the moment people stop watching you, you stop being useful. And they were watching. Subtly. Measuring my reaction. I didn't ask questions. I didn't volunteer information. I watched. I watched which doors stayed locked longer than necessary, which guards were reassigned, which wing of the house suddenly became off-limits. And I watched how carefully no one mentioned her room. They didn't want anyone thinking about where she'd been, only about where she wasn't. The billionaire eventually turned to me and asked if I'd seen her recently. Not accusatory, curious. That was a test. I told him the truth. I'd seen her the afternoon before. Calm, focused, not running from anything, not fragile, not confused. That answer landed wrong. I could see it, because it didn't fit the story they were preparing. The lockdown stretched into hours. No police, no press. No external authorities, just internal movement, private calls, legal teams arriving under the guise of support. That's when I understood the real danger. This wasn't about finding her. It was about controlling what happened next. If she stayed missing long enough, they could frame the disappearance however they needed. Mental health, instability, voluntary disappearance, anything that preserved the structure. But I knew something they didn't. I knew she wouldn't leave without a plan. And I knew exactly where she'd go if she needed to disappear without triggering alarms. Because months earlier, she'd asked me a strange question. If you needed to leave this house without anyone knowing, where would you go? At the time, I'd answered half-jokingly. Now, it felt like a map. There was a part of the estate no one thought about anymore. An old service route beneath the property. Built decades ago, before surveillance was digital, before control depended on cameras instead of memory. It wasn't abandoned. It was forgotten. And forgotten spaces are the most dangerous ones for people who rely on visibility to maintain power. I waited. That was the hardest part. If I moved too quickly, I'd draw attention. If I hesitated too long, they'd finalize the narrative. Timing mattered more than certainty. When the house quieted just enough, I slipped away. No flashlight, no phone. Just memory. The passage was exactly where I remembered it, hidden behind a panel that had been painted over so many times it looked permanent. The air was cold, dusty, untouched. She'd planned this. Every step deeper confirmed it. Footprints. Recent. Careful. She wasn't fleeing. She was repositioning. That realization changed everything. Because this wasn't a disappearance, it was a move. And moves only make sense when you understand the board. As I followed the tunnel, I understood why only I knew where to look. Because everyone else was focused on containment. I was focused on intention. And intention tells you far more than fear ever will. The tunnel opened into a small structure at the edge of the property. A place no one monitored because no one believed it mattered anymore. The light inside was on. That's when I knew I was right. But I also knew that if I was right, then time was no longer on our side. Because once power realizes it's lost someone, It can't immediately retrieve. It stops pretending to be careful, and whatever came next would determine whether her disappearance stayed a secret or became the most dangerous truth that house had ever tried to bury. The door creaked when I pushed it open, just enough to remind me that silence is never guaranteed. She was sitting at a small wooden table, coat still on, hair slightly damp, a single lamp casting long shadows across the room. No panic, no tears, just focus. The kind of focus you only get when a decision has already been made and there's no turning back. She looked up and didn't seem surprised to see me. "I was wondering how long it would take you," she said. That's when I knew this wasn't improvisation. This was execution. I asked her if she was okay. A useless question, but sometimes it's the only way to ground yourself when the situation feels unreal. She nodded and gestured for me to sit. On the table were documents. Originals, not copies. Old trust papers, medical evaluations, letters written by her mother that had never been submitted anywhere official. "This is everything they never wanted in the same room," she said. The house above us was still locked down. Phones buzzing, lawyers pacing, security pretending they were searching while making sure they weren't. And down here, in a space they'd erased from their mental map, she had finally created distance. Not distance to escape, distance to think. She told me she'd realized something important in the weeks leading up to that night. That every time she tried to assert control from inside the house, it triggered a response designed to absorb her back into the system. The structure was elastic. It could stretch, but it always snapped back, so she stopped pulling against it. She stepped outside of it instead. "I didn't vanish because I was afraid," she said. "I vanished because I needed them to react without me present." That was the brilliance of it. Power is confident when it can observe. It unravels when its subject disappears. Because without visibility, control becomes guesswork, and guesswork breeds mistakes. She showed me the sequence she'd planned, the timing, the reason she left when she did, the people she knew would be called first, the assumptions they'd make, the order in which they'd prioritize reputation over urgency. "They won't call the police for at least 12 hours, she said calmly. Maybe longer. She was right. Because calling the police means surrendering narrative control. And they weren't ready to do that yet. She had left behind just enough ambiguity to paralyze them. No note, no confrontation, nothing that could be framed cleanly. The house didn't know whether to be afraid or defensive. That hesitation was her leverage. I asked her what she wanted me to do. She thought for a moment before answering. "Nothing yet," she said. "Your job is to remain where you're least threatening. Invisible." I understood immediately. If I stayed missing too, alarms would go off. If I reappeared with information, they'd clamp down harder. The safest thing I could be was ordinary. So I left. That was harder than finding her. Walking back into the house knowing what I knew, pretending I hadn't seen her, pretending I was still operating inside their version of reality. But the moment I stepped inside, I saw it. The cracks. The stepmother was asking too many questions. Security had started contradicting itself. One of the lawyers was already drafting contingencies instead of solutions. They weren't searching for her anymore. They were preparing explanations. That's when I realized the next phase had already begun. Her disappearance wasn't just forcing them to react. It was forcing them to reveal priorities. And priorities tell the truth faster than confessions ever do. I stayed quiet, answered questions carefully, let myself be overlooked again. The billionaire glanced at me once, longer than necessary, as if trying to decide whether I was part of the problem or still beneath it. That uncertainty worked in our favor. Hours passed, still no police, still no outside involvement. Just internal tension tightening like a wire pulled too far. Eventually, someone suggested she might have left voluntarily. Another suggested a medical episode. The language was already shifting. That's when I knew she'd timed it perfectly. Because once people start speculating publicly, they stop coordinating privately. The narrative fragments. Authority weakens. I slipped out again near dawn, just long enough to leave something where it would be found by the right person. Not proof. A question. One document placed slightly out of order, enough to destabilize the story they were rehearsing. By the time the sun came up, the house no longer felt locked down. It felt exposed, and somewhere beneath it, she was still ahead of them. Because she hadn't vanished to disappear. She'd vanished to be impossible to control. And once someone learns how to do that, everything changes. By mid-morning, the house had split into factions, not officially. Nothing that clean. But you could feel it in the way conversations stopped when certain people entered rooms, in the way instructions were repeated twice by different voices that no longer trusted each other. Control thrives on unity. What she'd created was fragmentation. That's when mistakes happen. I watched one of the senior advisors argue quietly with the head of security about whether the gates should remain closed. Another insisted on reopening them to avoid suspicion. Someone else worried about neighbors noticing the unusual activity. No one mentioned her by name anymore. She had become a variable, not a person. That was intentional. When someone becomes a variable, they stop being managed emotionally and start being managed strategically. And strategy, unlike emotion, leaves fingerprints. I kept my head down, but my ears open. I learned who was calling whom, which firms were being looped in, which conversations were being avoided altogether. The pattern was clear. They were preparing for discovery, not rescue. That told me everything I needed to know about how they saw her, as a risk, not as family. I slipped away again just after noon, using the same route as before. The tunnel felt different in daylight, even without sunlight reaching it. Less ominous, more utilitarian. Proof that it had never been mystical or secret, just neglected. She was still there, but she'd changed positions. The documents were sorted now, stacked with purpose. A small bag sat by the door. She wasn't waiting. She was staging. "They're starting to fracture," I told her. She nodded, unsurprised. "Good. That means the timing is holding." She explained the next step calmly, like someone walking through a checklist. There were people outside the family who needed to be informed, but not all at once. Information loses power when it arrives as noise. It needed to arrive as inevitability. She planned to reappear. Not dramatically, not pleading, on her terms. But not yet. "Right now," she said, "they're still deciding what version of me is safest for them. I need to let them finish that thought." I asked her if she was worried they'd escalate. She smiled faintly. "They already have. They just don't realize it yet." She showed me a message she'd drafted but not sent. A single email addressed to one person. Someone whose involvement would change everything instantly. It wasn't accusatory. It wasn't emotional. It was factual, precise, unignorable. She hadn't sent it yet because once she did, there would be no more ambiguity. The game would move from internal containment to external accountability. And that shift is irreversible. Back in the house, the billionaire finally made his first real mistake. He ordered a partial reopening, not out of confidence, but impatience. He believed the longer she stayed missing, the more control he'd lose over the optics. So he tried to normalize the environment before the situation was resolved. That move created a contradiction. You can't act like nothing is wrong while quietly insisting something is. People noticed. Staff whispered. Drivers exchanged looks. Someone outside called the estate asking questions no one had answers for. The silence around her absence became louder than any announcement could have been. By evening, I could feel the pressure tipping from inward to outward. That's when I received a message from her. Just one line. "It's time to move the frame." I knew what that meant. The frame wasn't the disappearance. It was the reason for it. I left the house openly this time. No secrecy, no tunnels. I wanted to be seen. I wanted my absence to be noted without explanation. Because visibility, used selectively, can be just as powerful as disappearance. When I reached her, she was already packing the last of the documents. The calm she carried wasn't confidence. It was commitment. The kind that settles in once you've accepted the cost of what comes next. She asked me one final question before we separated. "Are you ready for this to get bigger than us?" I didn't answer immediately, because readiness isn't certainty. It's alignment. And I was aligned. I nodded. She sent the email. Nothing happened right away. That's how you know it worked. Because when information hits the right place, the response isn't noise, it's movement. And somewhere above us, inside a house that had locked itself down to maintain control, the first realization was forming. She hadn't vanished to escape. She'd vanished to reposition the truth. And once the truth changes position, no amount of locking doors can stop what follows. The response didn't come as a phone call or a message. It came as silence. Not the controlled silence of the house earlier, but the kind that follows when something has landed exactly where it was meant to. The kind where people stop speculating because they're waiting for instruction from a level above them. That's when you know the frame has shifted. Back at the estate, the mood changed almost immediately. Conversations ended mid-sentence. Phones were answered outside instead of in hallways. The stepmother disappeared into a room and didn't re-emerge. The billionaire retreated from visibility, no longer orchestrating, just reacting. Power hates reacting. Reacting means the tempo belongs to someone else. I moved through the house one last time, not hiding, not inserting myself, just observing. People avoided eye contact now. Not because they suspected me, but because uncertainty had made everyone careful. When no one knows who's watching whom, trust evaporates. Someone finally mentioned calling the police. Too late. That option had expired the moment they chose containment over urgency. Any report filed now would raise questions they could no longer answer cleanly. Why the delay? Why the internal lockdown? Why the legal teams arrived before law enforcement? They'd traded safety for control, and lost both. I left before anyone could stop me, not dramatically, no confrontation. I walked out through the front gate as it reopened, past guards who suddenly weren't sure they were supposed to question me. Authority blurs quickly when it stops being absolute. She and I didn't meet again right away. That was deliberate. From this point forward, proximity could be reframed as collusion. We didn't need proximity anymore. The truth had momentum of its own now. All it needed was space. News traveled quietly at first. Not public headlines, but internal shifts. Appointments postponed. Meetings canceled. Advisors distancing themselves without explanation. The kind of movement that doesn't show up on the surface, but rearranges everything underneath. The house stopped being a fortress. It became a liability. I received a message from her 2 days later. Short. Measured. I'm safe. I'm visible. And I'm not going back. That was all. It was enough. I understood then that disappearance had never been the goal. Presence was, just not on terms they could control. She hadn't vanished to hide. She'd vanished to reset the rules of engagement. When she reappeared publicly, it wasn't emotional. It wasn't chaotic. It was calm, structured, accompanied. She didn't accuse. She didn't dramatize. She confirmed her safety, her autonomy, and her intention to operate independently going forward. Every word chosen carefully. Every pause deliberate. The story they'd been preparing collapsed under its own contradictions. Because once she spoke for herself, every version of her they'd circulated became obsolete. I watched from a distance as the narrative corrected itself. Slowly, unevenly, but unmistakably. People began asking the right questions, not out of outrage, but out of logic. And logic is much harder to deflect than emotion. The billionaire never spoke publicly. That told me more than any statement could have. Silence at that stage wasn't dignity. It was damage assessment. I didn't feel victorious. I felt resolved. Because what had unfolded wasn't a takedown. It was a rebalancing. Control hadn't been destroyed. It had been diluted. Spread across too many observers to ever be absolute again. That was enough. I went back to my life, not unchanged, but unburdened. I no longer carried the weight of knowing something that couldn't be acted on. The truth was no longer trapped inside a locked house. It was in motion, and motion changes outcomes. Sometimes I think about that night, about how easily she could have stayed, how many reasons there were to endure quietly instead of disappearing, how tempting it is to survive by shrinking. But she didn't shrink. She stepped sideways. And that made all the difference, because systems are built to anticipate resistance. They are not built to handle refusal. Refusal to play the assigned role. Refusal to accept the framing. Refusal to stay where control can reach you. That's what she taught me, and it's why, when the house locked down and everyone else searched the obvious places, only one person knew where to look. Not because I was smarter, but because I understood her intention. She wasn't lost. She was ahead. And once someone learns how to move like that, the story can never be fully contained again. After everything settled into its new shape, what lingered wasn't relief. It was awareness. The kind that stays with you long after the noise fades, long after the headlines move on, long after the people involved stop pretending nothing happened. Awareness changes how you stand in a room, how you listen, how you interpret silence. I felt it most when people asked me what it had been like. They wanted drama, a chase, a showdown, something clean and cinematic. I never gave them that, because the truth didn't work that way. The most decisive moments hadn't been loud. They'd been quiet, procedural, almost boring to anyone who didn't understand what was at stake. That's how real power shifts, not with explosions, but with recalibration. I noticed how quickly people tried to simplify what she'd done. They called it bravery, or rebellion, or a breakdown turned into clarity. They needed a label they could recognize, something that fit an existing box. But what she did didn't fit a box. She didn't fight the system. She stepped outside of it and let it reveal itself. That distinction mattered, because fighting gives the system something to push against. Stepping away forces it to expose how much of its authority depended on proximity and compliance. I started seeing that distinction everywhere. In workplaces where someone didn't argue their way out of exploitation, but simply left, taking competence with them. In relationships where someone stopped explaining themselves and let the imbalance become obvious. In communities where silence stopped being automatic and questions were allowed to linger. Those moments didn't look heroic. They looked uncomfortable. And discomfort, I learned, is often the first sign that something honest is happening. She adapted to her new visibility faster than I expected, not because it was easy, but because she'd already lived under scrutiny. The difference now was consent. She chose when and how she was seen. That choice changed everything. We spoke occasionally, always briefly. Our conversations weren't about strategy anymore. They were about orientation, about what it means to move forward without constantly checking over your shoulder. She told me once that she'd started noticing how often people projected their fear onto her calm. How unsettling it was for some that she didn't need to justify herself anymore. That she could say no without softening it, and yes without explanation. That kind of autonomy makes people nervous, because it removes leverage. I recognized the same reactions in my own life. People who had once felt comfortable giving advice now hesitated. People who had assumed access now waited for invitation. The shift wasn't dramatic, but it was consistent. Consistency builds credibility, and credibility changes how people behave around you. I realized then that the house hadn't really been about walls or gates or surveillance. It had been about expectation, about roles that never needed to be enforced because everyone accepted them as natural. Once those roles were disrupted, everything else followed. The billionaire's silence continued. No denials, no clarifications, just distance. Distance is often the last tool left when influence fails. It allows people to preserve an internal version of events even when the external one no longer cooperates. I didn't begrudge him that. Understanding doesn't require forgiveness. It requires accuracy. And accurately, I knew this wasn't over in the sense people like endings to be over. Power doesn't disappear. It migrates. It adapts. It waits for new structures, new narratives, new ways to consolidate. But something had been permanently altered. The certainty. Certainty had cracked. And once that happens, even the strongest systems operate differently. They hesitate. They consult. They hedge. They leave room for observers they can no longer ignore. That room is where change lives. I carried that knowledge with me as I moved deeper into my own life, making choices with a different internal metric. Not asking whether something was impressive or safe, but whether it required me to be smaller than I was willing to be. That question became non-negotiable. Sometimes it led me away from opportunities others would have chased. Sometimes it led me into spaces that didn't look powerful at first glance, but felt aligned in a way I'd learned to trust. Alignment doesn't announce itself. You recognize it by the absence of tension, by the way your body stops bracing, by the way silence feels neutral instead of threatening. Those were sensations I'd learned late, but thoroughly. I thought often about how close everything had come to a different outcome. How easily her disappearance could have been reframed into something permanent and damaging if timing had been even slightly off. How much depended on people noticing the right details at the right moment. It reminded me that systems aren't undone by force. They're undone by miscalculation, by assuming no one is paying attention, by believing containment is the same as control. That belief had cost them, and it had taught me something I carried forward without needing to say it out loud. When a house locks down, when stories are aligned too quickly, when urgency is replaced with management, the truth is rarely missing. It's being relocated. And once you understand that, you stop searching where you're told to look. You start asking why the search is happening at all. That question stayed with me. It still does. Not as suspicion, but as orientation. A way of moving through the world that doesn't rush to conclusions, doesn't accept first drafts of reality, and doesn't mistake order for justice. The night she vanished changed the house forever. But it also changed me, not into someone louder, but into someone harder to mislead. And that, I learned, is what power fears most. Not exposure, not rebellion, but someone who understands how the game actually works and chooses, quietly, not to play it the way it was designed. That understanding settled into me slowly, like sediment after a storm. At first, it was just a heightened sensitivity. I noticed pauses where others didn't. I caught inconsistencies that once would have slid past me because they sounded confident enough. Over time, that sensitivity became instinct. Not suspicion, but discernment. The difference matters. Suspicion assumes intent. Discernment observes pattern. Patterns tell you what people won't. I stopped being impressed by urgency. I'd seen how often urgency was manufactured to force decisions before questions could form. When something mattered, truly mattered, it could withstand examination. It could wait. Anything that demanded immediate compliance usually benefited from speed more than truth. That shift changed how I interacted with authority. I didn't resist it reflexively. I didn't defer to it automatically. I treated it as a variable, not a constant. Something to be understood in context, not obeyed by default. People noticed. Not in obvious ways, but in how conversations adjusted around me, how explanations became longer, how certainty softened into persuasion. That's when you know something fundamental has changed. When power starts explaining itself, even subtly, it's already adapting. I thought about her often during that period, not out of concern, but out of recognition. She'd been forced into discernment long before I had. What came naturally to me now had been survival for her. That perspective kept me humble. Awareness feels empowering until you remember the cost it often comes with. We crossed paths once, unexpectedly, months later. A public place. Neutral ground. No tension. No need to perform distance or familiarity. Just two people acknowledging a shared history without letting it define the present. She looked lighter. Not happier in a dramatic way. Just less compressed. Like someone no longer holding themselves in to fit a space that was never designed for them. We talked briefly. About ordinary things. Work, weather, small plans. That normalcy felt like the real victory. Before we parted, she said something that reframed everything again. They never lost control, she said. They just lost exclusivity. That was it. Control hadn't vanished. It had multiplied. Distributed across observers, institutions, processes that couldn't be aligned with a single phone call. That kind of dilution doesn't make headlines, but it changes incentives. Incentives shape behavior, and behavior shapes outcomes. I carried that insight forward into places that had nothing to do with billionaires or estates or disappearances, into everyday situations where influence is quieter but no less real. Teams, organizations, relationships, anywhere roles harden without question. I became attentive to who controlled information flow, to who decided what was discussed and what was deferred, to whose discomfort was prioritized and whose was dismissed as noise. Those dynamics repeat everywhere. Once you recognize them, you start intervening without making a scene. You ask a question at the right moment. You delay a decision just long enough. You reframe a premise before it solidifies. Small acts, strategically placed, can disrupt trajectories more effectively than confrontation ever could. That realization gave me a strange sense of calm. Not because the world felt fairer, but because it felt legible. Legibility reduces fear. It doesn't eliminate risk, but it allows you to assess it accurately. I stopped confusing unpredictability with danger. Some of the safest moments in my life came when outcomes were uncertain, but choices were mine. Some of the most dangerous moments came wrapped in certainty that demanded obedience. That distinction guided me more than any rule ever had. I noticed something else, too. How often people underestimate quiet resolve. They mistake it for indecision, for passivity, for lack of ambition. But quiet resolve doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need reinforcement. It just persists. She had embodied that. Not by vanishing forever, but by choosing when and how to be present. By refusing to be positioned where control could reach her without consent. By understanding that visibility is only power when you choose it. I practiced the same thing in my own way. Not disappearing, but repositioning. Not rejecting systems wholesale, but refusing to internalize their distortions. That balance isn't easy. You don't get applause for it, but you get coherence. And coherence, once you experience it, becomes difficult to trade away. The house eventually faded into memory, but the lessons didn't. They surfaced in moments of choice. In decisions that felt small but weren't. In opportunities that asked for silence as the price of admission. I learned to recognize that price quickly. And I learned to walk away when it wasn't one I was willing to pay. The night she vanished had exposed something fragile beneath all that order. Not corruption in the dramatic sense, but dependency. A reliance on invisibility. On compliance. On the assumption that no one would step sideways. That assumption had been wrong. And because it had been wrong once, it could be wrong again. That knowledge didn't make me reckless. It made me deliberate. I stopped looking for certainty in outcomes and started looking for integrity in process. How decisions were made, who was consulted, who wasn't. Integrity, I learned, is easier to maintain upstream than it is to restore downstream. That's where attention belongs, upstream. Where narratives are formed, where roles are assigned, where disappearance becomes the only option left to someone who was never meant to need it. Understanding that doesn't make you cynical. It makes you careful. Careful in a way that respects complexity without surrendering clarity. And as I continued forward, building a life shaped less by reaction and more by intention, I realized something quietly reassuring. The most powerful shifts don't announce themselves. They unfold. And once they do, they keep unfolding, long after the house unlocks, long after the search ends, long after everyone else believes the story is over. That unfolding didn't feel like momentum. It felt like gravity. Not pulling me forward, but keeping me grounded when situations tried to tilt me back into old habits. There were moments when it would have been easier to forget everything, to let the experience become a story I told once in a while instead of a lens I carried every day. But the lens never left, because once you've seen how easily reality can be shaped, you stop trusting surfaces. You start paying attention to edges. I noticed how often decisions were justified with phrases that sounded reasonable, but meant very little. This is how it's always been done. We don't have time to revisit that. It's not personal. Each one designed to close a conversation before it fully opened. Each one a signal that something was being protected, not necessarily something valuable, but something familiar. Familiarity is powerful. It convinces people to defend systems that don't serve them simply because those systems are known. I'd done that myself for years without realizing it. I thought endurance was loyalty. I thought adaptation was maturity. Now I knew better. Endurance without agency is erosion. I became more attentive to erosion, to the slow wearing down of people who were constantly asked to adjust while nothing around them changed, to the way confidence disappears when it's repeatedly questioned by authority that never explains itself. I saw her experience reflected in smaller stories everywhere. Different scale, same structure. Someone framed as too much, someone else described as hard to work with, another quietly removed from conversations that mattered. Each case explained away with tone instead of substance. Tone is one of the most efficient tools of dismissal. I learned to listen past it. I learned to ask what was actually being said, stripped of delivery, stripped of reputation. Often, what remained was clarity that had simply been made inconvenient. That realization sharpened my sense of responsibility. Not responsibility to intervene everywhere, That's neither realistic nor healthy, but responsibility to not become complicit through inattention, to not accept explanations that relied on someone else's silence. Silence has its place, but silence chosen under pressure isn't neutral. I thought about the house sometimes, how it had locked itself down in an attempt to preserve order, only to expose how fragile that order really was, how quickly control turned inward when it couldn't move outward, how fear of visibility drove decisions that made visibility inevitable. That pattern repeated itself in subtle ways all around me, in organizations that doubled down on internal reviews instead of engaging external scrutiny, in leaders who spoke about transparency while limiting access, in systems that promised protection but punished autonomy. Each time I recognized the early signs, the tightening, the alignment of language, the avoidance of independent voices. Those signs no longer alarmed me. They oriented me. They told me where I was standing in relation to power and whether that position was sustainable. Sometimes it wasn't. And when it wasn't, I moved. Not abruptly, not dramatically, just deliberately. Movement doesn't have to be loud to be effective. Sometimes the most disruptive thing you can do is exit quietly, taking your perspective with you. Systems notice absence more than dissent. Absence can't be managed with rhetoric. She had understood that instinctively. Disappear first, then reappear where control couldn't reach. That wasn't escape. It was strategy. I applied that logic to my own life in smaller, less visible ways. Stepping back from environments that required constant self-editing, choosing work that valued clarity over compliance, building relationships where disagreement didn't threaten connection. Those choices didn't make life simpler, they made it steadier. And steadiness, I learned, is rare in a world that confuses intensity with importance. There were still moments of doubt. Times when I wondered whether I was overinterpreting, reading patterns where none existed. That's the risk of awareness. It can slide into projection if you're not careful. So I checked myself constantly. I asked whether the pattern was consistent, whether it appeared across contexts, whether incentives aligned with behavior. Awareness without discipline turns into paranoia. Awareness with discipline becomes insight. I stayed disciplined. I stayed curious. And curiosity kept me open, rather than hardened. I didn't become someone who distrusted everything. I became someone who trusted selectively, based on coherence rather than confidence. That distinction saved me more than once. I saw people rise quickly on certainty and fall just as fast when circumstances shifted. I saw quieter people endure because they didn't anchor their identity to roles that could be revoked. I learned from that. I stopped anchoring myself to positions. I anchored myself to principles. Principles don't guarantee outcomes, but they guarantee alignment. And alignment creates resilience. The disappearance, the lockdown, the search that wasn't really a search, all of it had been a catalyst. Not because of its drama, but because of what it revealed when pressure was applied. Pressure reveals priorities, and priorities reveal truth. That truth didn't belong to one family, one house, one night. It belonged to anyone willing to notice when control replaces care, when narrative replaces reality, when silence is mistaken for consent. I carried that with me, not as a warning, but as a guide. A way to navigate complexity without losing myself inside it. A way to remain present without being captured. And as life continued to present new situations, new systems, new versions of the same old dynamics, I found myself returning to one quiet question that had never failed me. Not what's happening, but who needs this to stay exactly the way it is? The answer to that question never gave me the whole truth, but it always pointed me in the right direction. And I followed it, step by step, without rushing, without retreating, letting the story continue to unfold, not toward an ending, but toward a deeper understanding of how power moves, how people adapt, and how clarity, once earned, keeps reshaping the path long after the doors unlock and the lights turn back on.